There is a photograph of Walt Whitman that most people have never really stopped to look at. Not the famous one with the white beard and the old man's gravitas, the earlier one. The one he put on the cover of his own book because no publisher would touch it. He's standing there, hat tilted to one side, shirt collar open at the throat, one hand resting easy on his hip. He looks like a man who has just come in from building something with his hands and has not yet bothered to change his clothes. He is not performing the role of poet. He does not look like anyone's idea of a poet. He looks like someone you might pass on the street and never think about again. That was exactly the point. Walt Whitman spent his entire life insisting that the most extraordinary things in the world were hiding inside the most ordinary ones. Inside the smell of sawdust, inside the face of a stranger on a ferry, inside the sound of a man singing to himself while he works. He believed this so completely, so stubbornly, that he was willing to destroy his reputation for it, lose jobs over it, get his book banned for it, and spend years being laughed at by people who considered themselves serious literary minds. And then, slowly, quietly, the world came around. It always does, with the people who were actually right. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Walt Whitman was born on the last day of May in 1819 in a place that no longer exists the way it existed then. West Hills, on Long Island, New York. Farmland, mostly. Apple orchards, the kind of sky you only get far enough from the city that you can actually see it properly. His father, Walter Sr., was a carpenter by trade. Quiet man, practical, the kind of person who believed that honest work done well was enough and did not spend much time wondering if there was something more. His mother, Louisa, was made of entirely different material. She had a gift for storytelling that Walt would later describe as the first education he ever received. She told him about the Quaker preachers she had grown up around, people who believed that God did not live only in churches, that the divine could be found in a blade of grass as easily as in any scripture. That idea, that radical, uncomfortable, beautiful idea, took root in her young son and never left. Walt was a quiet child, not shy exactly. There is a difference. Shy children shrink from the world. Walt was doing something else entirely. He was watching it. He would sit for long stretches at the edge of water, watching the way a spider moved across the surface, watching the light change on a moving river, listening to wind move through a field of tall grass, and hearing something in that sound that he could not yet name but knew was important. His siblings played and made noise, and he sat apart from them, not unhappily, just absorbed in something they could not see. His mother understood this about him. She left him alone to do it. When Walt was 4 years old, the family lost the farm. Money was the reason. It was almost always money in those years for families like theirs. They packed up and moved to Brooklyn, which in the early 1820s was not the place anyone would recognize today. It was a working port town, loud and dirty and alive in the way that port towns are, full of sailors and laborers and the constant smell of the harbor. For a small boy who had only ever known the particular silence of open country, Brooklyn was a kind of assault. And then, surprisingly quickly, it became a fascination. Walt had that ability to be disoriented by something new, and then to start paying extremely close attention to it, and then to love it. He would do this his whole life, with cities, with people, with suffering, with death. He never looked away from things. He looked harder. He got 6 years of schooling, maybe a little more. By the time he was 11, the family needed him to earn money, and that was the end of formal education. What he got instead was something better suited to what he would become. His first real job was at a law office, running errands, doing the small necessary tasks that kept things moving. He did not find it interesting. Then somebody gave him a chance at a printing press, the Long Island Patriot, a small weekly paper that needed a young apprentice who could learn the trade. He walked in, smelled the ink, watched the metal type being set by hand, letter by letter, and something happened to him that he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe. The idea that meaning, human feeling, human thought, the entire interior world of a person could be encoded in these small lead shapes and then pressed into paper and sent out into the world. that words had physical weight, that you could hold them in your hands. This was not a metaphor for Walt Whitman. It was a literal truth he experienced in that printing shop, and it never stopped being true for him. He was good at the work. He had an eye for it, an instinct for how type should sit on a page, how much space a sentence needed to breathe. And while he was setting other people's words, he was reading everything he could get his hands on. The Bible, Homer, Shakespeare, Sir Walter Scott, newspapers from everywhere. He read without a system and without guidance, which meant he read the way hungry people eat, indiscriminately, urgently, taking in whatever was in front of him. This is sometimes considered a weakness in a writer's education. For Whitman, it was a strength. He did not learn to read like a scholar. He learned to read like a person who needed to. In 1835, when he was 16, a massive fire tore through Lower Manhattan and destroyed most of the printing district. Whitman lost his job. He went back to Long Island, and for a few years, he taught school in small one-room schoolhouses scattered across the island. He was not a natural teacher, or at least not the kind the system wanted. He was too interested in his students as people rather than as problems to be managed, too inclined to let conversations wander into interesting territory rather than keeping them on the narrow path of the curriculum. He also found the work genuinely depressing, not the teaching itself, but the isolation. One room, the same faces, the same small daily compass. He was a person who needed the world to be large, and the world in a country schoolhouse is very small indeed. By 1838, he was restless enough to try something on his own. He started a weekly paper called The Long Islander, and for the better part of a year, he was its entire staff. Writer, editor, typesetter, and on horseback delivery man, riding out across Long Island every week to put copies in the hands of subscribers. It was too much for one person, and it folded. But the experience left him with something useful, the absolute certainty that journalism was where he belonged. He went back to New York in 1840 as a working newspaperman, and for the next decade, he worked at a series of papers, moved around, got hired and fired, wrote opinion pieces and cultural commentary and theater reviews and all the other things that newspapers in that era needed. He was opinionated, and he made enemies easily. He wrote about women's rights at a time when this was considered a dangerous eccentricity. He wrote critically about the expansion of slavery into new territories in a way that made people uncomfortable. He was let go from more than one position for essentially being too much trouble, too certain of his views, too unwilling to soften them when editors or owners found them inconvenient. But through all of this, something else was happening that nobody could see yet. In whatever time he had left after work, he was walking. He walked miles and miles through New York, both Manhattan and Brooklyn, not going anywhere in particular, just moving through the city and looking at it. He rode the ferries back and forth across the East River and stood on the deck watching the other passengers with the same attention he had given the spider on the water's surface when he was 4 years old. He went to lectures. He went to the opera, which he loved with an almost irrational intensity. The way the human voice could carry emotion past the boundaries of language, past what words alone could do. He sat in the park and watched people. He talked to strangers, which came naturally to him. He had the kind of face and the kind of bearing that made strangers feel comfortable talking back. And at night, or on the ferry, or in any quiet moment, he wrote things down in notebooks, not finished pieces, not poems in any recognizable sense, just notations, fragments, observations. The way a man's hands looked after a lifetime of physical work, the specific quality of light over the harbor in the late afternoon, the sound of a child crying 2 floors up in a tenement building. He was not yet sure what he was collecting all this for. He just knew that he needed to collect it. In 1848, a combination of factors, political disagreements at his paper, the general restlessness that never quite left him, led to a decision that would end up shaping everything. He took a job offer in New Orleans at a paper called The Crescent, and traveled down with his younger brother Jeff. The journey south, on steamboats along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, was the first time Whitman had seen the interior of America, and it overwhelmed him. He had known New York, which is its own kind of enormous, but he had not known the country, the actual physical scale of it, the way the landscape changed hour by hour, the varieties of people and ways of living packed into this one nation that was already, even in 1848, straining at its own contradictions. New Orleans itself was unlike any city he had encountered. French and Spanish colonial architecture, African rhythms in the music that came out of certain neighborhoods, a Creole culture that had developed its own distinct forms of everything: food, language, religion, death. He found it extraordinary. He also found something that permanently altered him. In New Orleans, slavery was not an abstraction. It was a market. You could walk past it on the street. People were sold in public auctions in the open air, examined, priced, separated from their families with the brisk efficiency of any other commercial transaction. Whitman stood and watched this happen. He was not, by this point in his life, someone who looked away from things. He did not look away from this. He stood there and he looked at it, and it went into him, and it did not come out the same way it went in. It came out later as fury, as grief, and as a conviction that the human body, every human body, was sacred, and that any system that treated it otherwise was not a political disagreement, but a moral catastrophe. He came back to New York after a few months and quietly stopped trying to hold a regular newspaper job. He moved back in with his family in Brooklyn. He helped his father with carpentry work. He spent enormous amounts of time on the Fulton Ferry, the regular service between Brooklyn and Manhattan that he would later write about with an almost religious intensity. He was not idle during these years. He was becoming something. He was reading Emerson, who had been writing and lecturing for years about the need for an authentically American literature, one that did not simply imitate European forms but grew out of the specific American experience. Whitman read this and felt as though someone had described exactly what was already forming in his notebooks without his fully understanding what it was. American poetry in 1850 was almost entirely English in its bones. Strict meter, regular rhyme schemes, elevated diction. The subjects that were considered appropriate for poetry were a fairly narrow list. The idea that you might write a poem about a laborer's body, or about the smell of a barnyard, or about the physical experience of being alive in a way that did not immediately spiritualize or metaphorize that experience, but actually just described it. This was not poetry by the standards of the day. It was something else, and that something else did not have a respectable name. Whitman gave it one eventually, but first he had to write it. What he was working toward in those years of notebooks and ferry rides and long walks and carpentry was a form of writing that matched the way he actually experienced the world. He did not experience the world in neat stanzas of 4 lines with a regular beat. He experienced it in long rhythmic surges, like breathing, like waves, like the Old Testament prophecy he had read and absorbed without quite knowing he was doing so. He experienced it as accumulation, thing after thing after thing, all of it equally present, equally weighted, the small and the enormous placed side by side because to him they were side by side, always had been, a spider and a nation, a single blade of grass and the whole of human mortality. He wrote sentences that went on for a long time, that built and built and built, that gathered details the way a river gathers tributaries, until the sentence itself felt like a physical force. By the spring of 1855, he had enough. He had a manuscript, and he could not find a publisher willing to touch it. This did not surprise him exactly. He had known it might come to this. So he went to a print shop in Brooklyn, run by 2 Scottish brothers named Rome, and he arranged to print the book himself. He set some of the type with his own hands. He knew how. He had been doing it since he was a boy. The book was 95 pages. It contained 12 poems, none of which had individual titles. The cover was dark green cloth with gold lettering. The title was Leaves of Grass. There was no author's name on the cover or the title page. Instead, there was an engraving, that photograph, the one with the open collar and the tilted hat and the hand on the hip. Whitman looking directly at you with an expression that is not quite challenging and not quite welcoming, but something in between. An expression that says, I am one of you. I am exactly one of you. The first edition sold almost nothing. Reviews ranged from puzzled to hostile. The poems were called formless. They were called obscene, which in 1855 could mean many things, but in this case largely meant that Whitman had written about the human body, its functions, its desires, its physical reality, without shame and without apology, in a way that struck respectable literary culture as a kind of barbarism. A few reviewers clearly had no idea what to make of it at all. One or two sensed that something significant had happened but could not articulate what. Then, some weeks after publication, a letter arrived. Ralph Waldo Emerson was at this point the most respected intellectual in America, a philosopher, an essayist, a lecturer, the central figure of the transcendentalist movement that had been arguing for years that America needed to develop its own spiritual and cultural identity rather than importing everything from Europe. Whitman had read him extensively. Whitman had, in some sense, been answering him in the pages of Leaves of Grass without knowing it. Emerson wrote that it was the most extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom that America has yet contributed. He told Whitman he stood at the beginning of a great career. The letter was 5 pages long. Whitman read it, and then he put it in his pocket, and for months he carried it with him everywhere. He would take it out under street lamps at night and read it again. Not because he needed the reassurance, or not only that, but because the letter itself felt like proof that he had not, in fact, been wrong about everything. For the second edition of the book in 1856, Whitman added more poems and added, without asking permission, a line from Emerson's letter stamped in gold on the spine. I greet you at the beginning of a great career, R.W. Emerson. This was not entirely proper. Emerson was apparently somewhat taken aback to find himself pressed into service as a blurb writer without being consulted, but Whitman needed the book to reach people, and he had learned enough about the world to know that Emerson's name on the spine would open doors that no amount of argument about poetic form would open. He was not wrong about that either. The years that followed were years of continued work and continued obscurity, the two things existing in parallel without quite resolving. Whitman kept adding to the book, kept revising it, kept putting out new editions. He also spent time at a bar called Pfaff's in Lower Manhattan, which was a gathering place for the bohemian element of New York. Artists, writers, actors, people with unconventional views about society and propriety and the proper organization of human life. He felt at home there in the way he had never quite felt at home in the respectable literary world. These were his people, or some of them were. And then, in April of 1861, everything changed. Fort Sumter fell, the South seceded, the Civil War began. Whitman was 41 years old. He was not young enough or healthy enough to enlist, and he did not try to. He wrote a poem in support of the Union called Beat, Beat, Drums. One of his least characteristic pieces, actually, closer to propaganda than to poetry, driven by a kind of martial urgency that was not really native to him. He wanted to support the cause, and the poem did that, but it did not yet know what the war was actually going to be. He found out in December of 1862. He was reading a newspaper and saw a list of casualties from a battle called Fredericksburg, and there on the list was his brother George. Lieutenant George W. Whitman. The entry did not say whether George was alive or dead, only that he had been wounded. Whitman did not wait. He emptied out his pockets, took what little money he had, and left for Virginia. He got his wallet stolen in Washington on the way through. He arrived in the camps with nothing and had to borrow money from a friend who happened to be there. He found George eventually in the camp near Fredericksburg. The wound was minor, a cut on the cheek. George was going to be fine. This should have been the end of it. Whitman could have gone back to New York relieved. He did not go back. He walked through that camp and through the field hospital attached to it, and he saw the interior of the war, not as it appeared in newspaper dispatches or patriotic prints, but as it actually was. Men with limbs missing, stacked outside the surgical tent in the cold. Men screaming and men not making any sound at all. Boys from Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania lying in the mud, some of them still in their teens, dying of wounds or of infections or of things the doctors could not name. The war was 18 months old and had already produced suffering on a scale that the people who started it had not imagined or had not let themselves imagine. Whitman looked at all of it. He was not a man who looked away. He decided to stay. He moved to Washington and spent the next 3 years visiting hospitals. There were dozens of them. Field hospitals, converted government buildings, churches pressed into service, the patent office building full of cots. Every day he would arrive with a basket. In the basket were things he had bought with his own money or with small donations from people back home. Oranges, apples, tobacco, stamps, envelopes, writing paper, a little jam, some biscuits. He was not a doctor. He was not a nurse. He could not do surgery, and he could not dispense medicine. What he could do was sit with a person, hold a hand, write a letter home for someone who could not write or could not move his arms. Read aloud to men too sick to hold a book. Sit through the night with someone who was frightened to die alone. He saw somewhere between 60 and 80,000 wounded soldiers over those 3 years. He sat with Union men and Confederate men alike. To Whitman, in those hospital rooms, they were not soldiers of the North or soldiers of the South. They were just people in pain, usually young, often very young, and he treated them the same. He kissed foreheads. He called them his dear boys. He meant it. He also wrote during this period with a directness and simplicity that was different from the ambitious grandeur of Leaves of Grass. His notebooks from the war years record specific men by name, their injuries, their particular manner of facing what was happening to them, the things they said. These notebooks became the book Drum Taps, published in 1865. It is a quieter book than anything he had written before. The war had taught him that some things do not need ornamentation, that certain kinds of truth are better delivered without the long rolling lines and the accumulated metaphors. A man dying deserves a plain sentence. He also got to know, after a fashion, Abraham Lincoln. They were both frequently in Washington during those years, and Whitman would often see Lincoln on the street or passing in a carriage. They never spoke. Whitman was not part of any circle that would have given him access to the president socially, but they saw each other, and they developed what Whitman later described as a habit of exchanging a bow and a silent acknowledgement. He watched Lincoln age across those years with the mournful attention he gave to everything. He saw the weight of the war accumulating in Lincoln's face and in his posture, and he understood it in a way that was personal because he had been in the hospitals, because he knew what the weight was made of. In April of 1865, the war ended, and then, within days, Lincoln was shot. Whitman was in Brooklyn when it happened. He received the news the way most of the country received it, with a shock that was almost physical, followed by a grief that took a long time to become anything coherent. Lincoln had been, to Whitman, something more than a president. He had been proof that democracy could produce something genuinely great, that the ordinary could become extraordinary, that the system was not merely a machine for consolidating power, but might actually occasionally generate wisdom. Without Lincoln, this proof disappeared, and Whitman felt that loss as a wound to his sense of the possible. He wrote 2 poems about it. One, When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed, is formally and emotionally one of the most complex things he ever produced. A long meditation that works through 3 symbols simultaneously, a sprig of lilac, a hermit thrush's song, and a western star, and never quite says its subject directly, but circles it with a kind of ritual reverence. The other, O Captain, My Captain, is simpler, more accessible, more immediately comprehensible as an elegy. The one school children were eventually assigned, the one that made him famous in a way that his more ambitious work had not. He was somewhat ambivalent about this fame, about the fact that the piece he had dashed off in a more conventional form should be the one that everyone knew, but he accepted it. It had reached people. That was the point. After the war, he settled into a government job, a clerk's position in the Attorney General's office in Washington, and for a few years he had something he had rarely had before: stability, a regular income, a small apartment of his own, time to keep working on the book, which he continued to add to and revise. He was already planning the next edition and the one after that. Then the job in the Interior Department, he had briefly held a position there before moving to the Attorney General's office, produced one of the stranger episodes of his career. The Secretary of the Interior, a man named James Harlan, was cleaning out his staff and found a copy of Leaves of Grass in Whitman's desk. He fired Whitman on the spot. The book, he said, was obscene. This was not the first time Whitman had been called obscene, and it was not the last. But a friend of his, William O'Connor, was so furious about the dismissal that he wrote and published a pamphlet called The Good Gray Poet, which defended Whitman at considerable length and placed him in the company of Shakespeare, and compared him to Jesus, which was perhaps a bit much, but was effectively outraged. The pamphlet attracted enough attention to get Whitman the new position, and also, somewhat accidentally, gave him a nickname that stuck, the Good Gray Poet, which became, across the following decades, a kind of affectionate shorthand for everything he represented. It was during these Washington years that Whitman met a young man on a streetcar during a storm. His name was Peter Doyle. He was Irish-born, a former Confederate soldier who had wound up in the Capitol after the war, working as a streetcar conductor. They were as different as two people can be in terms of background, education, temperament, politics. They became inseparable. What the relationship was exactly, what it meant to both of them, is a question that has no clean answer. Whitman's era did not have the same frameworks for understanding such things that we have now, and even if it had, the penalties for certain kinds of love were severe enough to ensure that both men would have been careful about what they said openly and what they kept to themselves. What remains is the letters Whitman wrote to Peter. "My darling boy," he called him, and the poems in the Calamus section of Leaves of Grass, which had been there since 1860 and which describe a particular kind of love between men with a tenderness and specificity that feels impossible to read as purely abstract. What remains also is Peter Doyle's own testimony years later, when he was an old man, about the central place Whitman had occupied in his life. The relationship lasted, in some form, for the rest of Whitman's life. When Whitman moved away and got sick and could no longer easily travel, they wrote to each other. They were not the same, separated, as they had been in Washington, but they remained connected. Whitman never wrote directly about this. He could not. That is worth sitting with for a moment. The man who made a life's work out of saying everything, who wrote about the body with more openness than anyone in American literature before him, who insisted that nothing human should be left out of the poem, had one large and defining thing in his own life that he had to leave out of the official record. You can feel the shape of that absence in the work if you know to look for it. In 1873, Whitman had a stroke. He was in his mid-50s. The stroke left him partially paralyzed, and he had to give up his government job and leave Washington. He went to his brother George's house in Camden, New Jersey, which is just across the river from Philadelphia, and for a while he seemed to be simply waiting for his health to return, for something to shift, for a reason to feel like himself again. His mother died that same year. She had been, across his whole life, the person he was closest to, not in the constant daily sense, but in some deeper constitutional sense, the first teacher, the first audience, the original source of his sense that ordinary life was worth close attention. He did not die in Camden, though. He recovered enough to keep working, and he discovered in the natural landscape near the city, a creek, some woods, open fields not far from the suburban houses, something that functioned for him as the countryside of his childhood had, a place where the world slowed down and became legible again. He spent hours in those woods. He sat by the water. He wrote in his notebooks. The body was diminished, but the attention was still there, still doing its patient, inexhaustible work. By the 1880s, Leaves of Grass had found readers in England and Europe in ways it had not quite found them at home. English writers and thinkers had been discovering it for years. Tennyson admired it. Gerard Manley Hopkins read it carefully. A whole generation of younger British writers found in it something that their own tradition did not offer. Oscar Wilde, on his American lecture tour in 1882, made a specific point of going to Camden to meet Whitman. They spent an afternoon together. Whitman made elderberry wine. They sat in his cluttered house full of papers and books and talked for hours. Wilde later told people it had been one of the memorable afternoons of his life, and you can understand why. Two men who had in common a refusal to be what their respective societies wanted them to be, sitting together in a small city in New Jersey, drinking homemade wine and talking about art and love and what either of those things was actually for. That same year, 1882, produced the most useful scandal of Whitman's career. The district attorney of Boston, where the book was to be published by a respectable house, threatened prosecution on obscenity grounds. The publisher backed out. Whitman found a Philadelphia publisher, and the resulting publicity, the serious men of Boston getting excited about this dirty book, did more for sales than any amount of positive reviewing could have done. People who had never heard of the book suddenly needed to read it. The edition sold out. For the first time in his life, Whitman had actual money. He bought a house. It was small and unpretentious, on Mickle Street in Camden, a two-story wooden structure in a working-class neighborhood. He filled it immediately with the accumulated paper of a lifetime: manuscripts, notebooks, correspondence, newspapers, books, loose pages of notes, stacks of things he was working on. There was barely room to move through some parts of it. He had always lived like this, with his materials close around him, and the house simply formalized what had always been true. In 1885, a widow named Mary Oakes Davis came to live with him and manage the household. She brought her cat, her dog, 2 doves, and a canary she was fond of. Whitman named the canary Pete, which was also the name he sometimes used for Peter Doyle, and this may or may not mean anything. And either way, he loved the bird and liked having it singing as company while he worked. The house was a mess, but it was alive. Visitors came from everywhere. Young writers who wanted to sit near greatness, journalists working on profiles, artists who wanted to paint him, ordinary readers who had been moved by the poems and felt compelled to make the journey to Camden just to see if the man was real. He almost always received them. He would offer a glass of water. He would talk. He had a gift for making people feel that he was genuinely interested in them, which was because he genuinely was. He had been genuinely interested in everyone he met since he was a child sitting at the edge of a river watching spiders. That did not diminish with age. If anything, as the body slowed and the world came mostly through windows and visitors rather than through his own movement through it, the quality of his attention intensified. There is a painting of him from these years, done by Thomas Eakins, who was probably the greatest American portrait painter of the era. Eakins painted him several times. In one portrait, Whitman looks not so much like a famous poet as like someone who has seen everything and is not surprised by any of it. Not cynical. There is no sourness in the face, just deeply, quietly at rest with what the world is. It is one of the most remarkable things Eakins ever painted, and Eakins painted remarkable things. Whitman kept adding to the book. In his last years, he was preparing what he called the deathbed edition, the final version of Leaves of Grass, the one he intended to be definitive, containing nearly 300 poems, the product of almost 40 years of work. The book that had started as 12 untitled poems in a self-published volume in 1855 had become something enormous. He talked about it the way a parent might talk about a child, with pride and also with the slightly baffled love one has for something that has grown entirely beyond what one originally imagined. He was also, carefully and without drama, preparing to die. He had a tomb built in Harley Cemetery, a few miles from his house. Simple granite, the design his own, set into a hillside under old trees. He visited the site while it was under construction and apparently found this satisfying rather than disturbing, which tells you something about where he had arrived in his relationship with mortality. Death, in the late poems, is not something to be fought or mourned. It is part of the process, the great compost, the way individual things return to the whole and become available to new individual things. He had believed this since early in his life, but in his old age, it stopped being a philosophy and became an experience. Something he felt in his body the way he had once felt the ferry rocking under him on the East River. In the last years, a young man named Horace Traubel came every day to sit with him and talk. Traubel kept meticulous notes of these conversations. Everything Whitman said, every digression, every memory that surfaced, even offhand comments about what he had eaten for breakfast and whether the quality of the morning light was good. These notes eventually became 9 volumes, an extraordinary record of a human mind in its final period, still fully engaged with the world, still curious, still willing to say what it thought. He died on March 26, 1892. He was 72 years old. Camden was quiet that evening. When the doctors examined the body afterward, they found evidence of damage so extensive, lungs barely functioning, a large abscess that had eroded one of his ribs, multiple organs showing the wear of decades of physical difficulty, that they were genuinely confused about how he had managed to live as long as he had, and certainly how he had managed through all of it to seem so. The word they apparently reached for was cheerful. He had been, by most accounts, consistently cheerful. Not falsely or performatively cheerful, but genuinely pleased to be alive, even when being alive was, physically, a considerable ordeal. More than 1,000 people came to the house in the hours after his death. The flowers on the coffin were so numerous and so densely arranged that the oak wood underneath was completely invisible. He was buried in the tomb he had designed, in the ceremony he had planned, which was not a funeral in any conventional sense, but more of a gathering. Music, readings, some food, the feeling of a celebration rather than a mourning. He would have approved. What he left behind was a book that is still changing how people think about what a poem is allowed to be. Leaves of Grass is not a collection of individual pieces that happen to share a cover. It is one long, continuous argument. An argument that the world is exactly as large as it seems, that every person in it carries something worth attending to, that death is not a defeat, that the body is not something to be ashamed of, that America is both magnificent and terrible, and that both of these things are true at once and have to be held together rather than resolved. These are not conclusions that Whitman reached and then wrote down. They are the poems themselves. The conclusions and the working toward them collapsed into a single gesture. He spent 40 years making the book. He started it as an apprentice printer who had never been to college, a carpenter's son from Long Island who had never quite fit into any of the worlds he moved through. He finished it as an old man in a small house full of papers, famous enough that people crossed oceans to visit him, still not entirely sure the world understood what he had done, still not entirely sure it mattered whether it did. It mattered. The world took its time figuring this out, which is more or less what the world always does with the things that actually matter. But it figured it out. Every poet writing in English after 1855 is writing in a different landscape than the one that existed before Whitman walked into that Brooklyn print shop and set his own type. Every American who has ever felt that the country was both their country and a stranger to them, that its scale and its contradictions were too large for any single story, has an antecedent in Whitman. He articulated something that was true before he named it and has remained true since. He said it himself best in the opening of his great poem, Song of Myself, which is the first poem in Leaves of Grass, and in some sense is Leaves of Grass, is the thing the whole edifice holds up. I am large, I contain multitudes. He was not boasting. He was describing the condition of being alive.